Hi, my name is Kari Turunen, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Vancouver Chamber Choir. This is the pre-concert talk of our concert, Missa. The second concert of our spring season and the fifth of our 50th anniversary season is built around the structure of a Mass, hence its Latin name, Missa. As you might guess, it features the central movements of the Mass, and we have added to these movements 4 contrasting motets. None of the 4 featured composers are exactly household names, but they are all excellent choral composers. The writing is assured, the textures varying, the sound created rich, and the vocal lines carefully wrought. And all this is achieved in an idiosyncratic way. Whilst respecting musical tradition, these composers have found a voice of their own. But before I go into the nuts and bolts, it is time to thank our generous concert patrons, Dr. Jeanette Gallant and Violet and Al Goosen. This concert was recorded in Vancouver's Christchurch Cathedral in late January 2021. Thank you for making it possible. The first of our composers is Cyrillus Kreek, an Estonian from the early 20th century. In Kreek's collection, Vaimulikud rahvaviisid, or spiritual folk songs, we find an amazing depth. The story goes like this. When Northern Europe embraced Lutheranism in the mid-1500s, there naturally was no specifically Lutheran music, no hymns in the vernacular. This void was first filled with Catholic hymns and then German chorales, increasingly translated into the local languages. These translated German chorales found their way into printed hymnals in the early 18th century. Now, these books were fairly expensive and rare, which meant the hymns had to be taught to the congregations by rote, by their pastors and cantors, most of whom were not trained musicians and were quite unlikely to be musically literate. This led to the hymns over time mutating and leading to variants in each and every congregation, where they were then handed down in their local form as an oral tradition. In many cases, this process ultimately led to the melodies being completely unrecognizable in comparison to the original. In time, these hymns became, as Kreek's title suggests, spiritual folk songs for both the church and the home, handed down from one generation to the other. But the story doesn't end here. In the early 20th century, Kreek was one of the many musicians and musicologists who gathered these melodies around Estonia. Kreek set about on his journey in the rural parishes of Western Estonia in the 1910s, whilst he was still a student at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Estonia at this time was a part of the Russian Empire. The hymns were most often sung to the collectors like Kreek by one locally well-known singer, or elder, if you like. While most collectors just took their findings to the archives, Kreek gave the story another twist. He set a few dozen of them for mixed choir around the time Estonia became independent, that is around 1918. For me, Kreek strikes a perfect balance between a chorale harmonization and an arrangement of folk music and gives these songs a new dimension. They are simultaneously ancient and modern, a real delight to sing. second composer, Josef Gabriel Rheinberger, a contemporary of Johannes Brahms, came from a privileged Liechtensteinian family and spent most of his life in German Bavaria. His most important position was that of the court Kapellmeister in Munich. In this position, Rheinberger performed a great deal of music we would now call early music, that is, works by the likes of de Lasso, Palestrina, Mozart, and Haydn. A deep understanding of tradition is always apparent in Rheinberger's great E-flat major Mass, Cantus Missae, from 1878, from which we take our Kyrie, Gloria, and Agnus Dei. Scored for double choir, it bows its head to Venetian choral sonorities, the linearity of Renaissance polyphony, and the harmonic clarity and melodic invention of the classical period. At the same time, it most definitely is a child of its own time. The harmonic language is quintessentially romantic. Written at the height of the Sicilian movement that demanded church music to look back and emulate the great Renaissance masters, Rheinberger seems to say, yes, we can look back, but our music must give expression to the feelings and intuitions of the people of our time. The third voice in this concert, Charles Villiers Stanford, was a central figure of musical life of fin de siècle of England. Stanford actually came from a well-off Irish family, but spent most of his life in Cambridge and London. Besides being a composer, he was an organist, conductor, and a teacher of composition, and his pupils included the likes of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Gustav Holst, and Ralph Vaughan Williams. His taste was fairly conservative, and his ideals were considered Germanic. His great paragon was Johannes Brahms. Despite this, Stanford's choral music is both classical and, in its ties to the Anglican tradition, English in character. The two motets of the program, Beati quorum via from 1888 and Ye Blessed Angels, published in 1913, are very different in character and scope. Beati is a short, flowing work in many ways reminiscent of Renaissance polyphony, whereas Ye Blessed Angels is a series of variations on a hymn melody by John Darwell. This almost 10-minute work is an impressive exhibition of Stanford's skills as a choral composer. Einojuhani Rautavaara is one of the most important choral composers of the last 70 years. The sheer body of this Finnish composer's works is staggering, and in his case, quantity, quality, and stylistic diversity go hand in hand. Missa a Cappella, from which the Credo, Sanctus, and Benedictus of this concert come, was his last major work, and it features all the hallmarks of the choral writing of his last creative period. Rautavaara defined himself as coming from the border of the East and the West, and was happy to write a Catholic Mass late in life, after trying his hand at a Russian Orthodox all-night vigil 40 years earlier. Rautavaara was a master at reusing his own musical material, which is most evident in the Credo of this Mass. The first time almost all of the material heard in the Credo appeared was in a small three-movement work for guitar called Partita from 1956. 2 years later, Rautavaara rewrote the piece for piano. From there, it morphed into Credo for a mixed choir in 1972. In an uncanny way, the instrumental music made complete sense in the shape of a Credo. And the last step was rewriting the music for the Mass, a mere 60 years later than the original music was conceived. The rhythmic drive of the outer movements of this Credo are compelling, and the fluid melodies of the central sections stay with you. The Sanctus and Benedictus are more typical of late Rautavaara, with 12-tone melodies accompanied by morphing triads. I hope you enjoy Missa and stay tuned for more video concerts during the spring.